We've been...
Not good. Anything more than that, and the map...
Excessive tilt.
The story begins as we see a group of NASA astronauts conducting research on Mars, specifically in a region called Acidalia Planitia. The crew is busy collecting soil samples when suddenly they receive an urgent alert. A massive and dangerous storm is approaching their location. As soon as he sees the message, Johnson quickly calls the commander and the rest of the team back inside the HAB. There, they learn that the storm is about to hit their MAV with a force of 86,000 newtons. The MAV, short for Mars Ascent Vehicle, is the rocket designed to lift the astronauts off the Martian surface and carry them to their spacecraft orbiting above Mars. However, for the MAV to function properly, it must remain upright. If the storm tips it over, the crew would be stranded on Mars forever. The situation is extremely critical, and there's no time to think. The commander immediately decides to abort the mission and return to Earth. She then leads her team toward the MAV. But unfortunately, by this point the storm has intensified into something far more violent, and conditions keep getting worse. The moment the commander opens the HAB's airlock, a powerful gust of wind blasts inside, nearly knocking them off their feet. Still, she regains control and pushes forward with the team toward the MAV. The 5 astronauts are only halfway there when suddenly an astronaut named Mark Watney is struck hard by a broken antenna from the HAB. The impact sends him flying like a rag doll into the raging storm, where he disappears from sight. Moments later, Martinez receives a warning on his computer. Mark's spacesuit is leaking oxygen. Panic spreads through the team. If all the oxygen escapes, Mark will die within seconds. Realizing this, the commander and her crew do everything they can to find him. But in that violent storm, even seeing each other is nearly impossible. They rely only on suit signals to stay connected, and contact with Mark is completely lost. In the end, they fail to locate him. Meanwhile, the MAV continues to tilt dangerously. The commander freezes for a moment, but she knows she can't risk the lives of the entire crew for one person. Beck concludes that without oxygen, Mark is already dead. With heavy hearts and tears in their eyes, the commander and her team return to the MAV. Before it can tip over completely, the commander orders the launch. Carrying the weight of Mark's presumed death, they leave Mars and head back to Earth. But the next morning, after the storm finally dies down, a shocking truth is revealed. Mark Watney is still alive. The antenna had pierced through his suit and into his body, but the combination of blood and the antenna itself sealed the breach, maintaining the suit's pressure and preventing oxygen from escaping. That's what saved his life. When Mark regains consciousness, he finds himself far away from the HAB, completely alone. He quickly realizes that the rest of the crew must have evacuated the previous night to escape the storm. Mark didn't make the foolish mistake of pulling the rod out on the spot. Instead, he detached it from the antenna dish and, fighting through intense pain, somehow managed to make his way back to the HAB. Inside, the air pressure was stable. Mark immediately ripped off his spacesuit and in one brutal motion yanked the rod out of his abdomen. His agonizing scream echoed throughout the entire HAB, but a small fragment of the antenna was still lodged inside his body. Using the first aid kit, Mark somehow managed to remove that piece as well, and then stapled his wound shut. The unbearable pain left his mind shaken, but this was only the beginning. Mark's real nightmare was just about to begin, because he was now completely stranded, alone in the harsh desert of Mars. The dish he had collided with was a communication satellite dish, and it was now completely destroyed. Because of that, Mark had no way to contact his crew or NASA. And even if, by some miracle, he managed to re-establish contact, it would take NASA at least 4 years to send any help to Mars. Right now, the HAB, the only place where Mark felt safe, was designed to last just 31 days. If the oxygen system failed before that, he would suffocate. If the water reclaimer, the system that purifies water, broke down, he would die of thirst. And even if the HAB somehow held together longer without any accidents, Mark simply didn't have enough food to survive for 4 years. At this point, his death seemed almost certain. Overwhelmed by the reality of his situation, Mark lost hope. He recorded everything in his computer log and finally sat down, waiting for death. For the next 2 days, a violent storm raged outside. Every second, Mark was haunted by the fear of dying. He now understood that his fate was sealed. He didn't have enough food, enough water, or any way to contact NASA. But then, something changed. Mark decided he wasn't going to die on Mars without a fight. So he came up with a plan, something no one had ever attempted before. He decided he would wait for NASA's Ares 4 mission, and when it finally arrived on Mars, he would leave with them. But there was a problem. The Ares 4 mission wouldn't launch for another 4 years. To survive that long, he needed food. So Mark began calculating his supplies. Even combining his rations with those left behind by his crew, he only had enough food to last about 1 year. But he needed to survive for 4. For a moment, he had no idea what to do. Then, his eyes landed on the potatoes, and suddenly, an idea sparked in his mind. Mark made a bold decision. He would start farming on Mars. He had a few potatoes available, and he planned to grow more from them. But to make the Martian soil fertile, he would need a large amount of water, and on Mars, there wasn't a single drop to be found. Mark is a professional botanist, so he knows exactly what it takes to grow crops. Now, he begins fully preparing to start farming on Mars. Watney first gathers a large amount of soil in one place and turns that area into something like a farm. To make the soil fertile, Mark brings in human waste. Basically astronaut feces, which smells absolutely terrible. But despite that, he endures it and successfully turns it into fertilizer. Then, he cuts the potatoes into pieces and plants them in the soil along with the fertilizer so they can grow. But now, he needs to produce water. The good thing is, Mark knows how to make water. By burning hydrogen with oxygen, water can be created, and Watney has all the necessary equipment to do it. The first time he mixes hydrogen and oxygen, a massive explosion occurs because he doesn't calculate the extra oxygen already present in the room from his own breathing. But the next time, he carefully mixes hydrogen and oxygen in the correct ratio and successfully ignites it, starting the process of water production. Through this process, vapor forms and begins to condense into small droplets of water. Soon he has enough water for the soil. After a few days, the first plant sprouts, and seeing it fills Mark with immense joy. Meanwhile, back on Earth, NASA informs the media that Mark Watney is no longer alive. The news spreads like wildfire across the world, and his funeral is even held. The next day, Vincent is shown arriving at NASA headquarters, asking the director to redirect a satellite toward the Ares 3 mission site. However, Director Teddy refuses, fearing that if they do, Mark Watney's body might be visible to the entire world, damaging NASA's reputation and making it harder to secure funding for future missions. But Vincent doesn't give up. He sends the coordinates of the Ares 3 mission area, specifically the HAB location, to Mindy, a satellite specialist. When Mindy points the satellite camera at those coordinates, she's shocked. She notices that the equipment has been moved from its original positions, and even the rover has been relocated. At that moment, she realizes Mark is still alive. She immediately calls Vincent, the head of the Mars program, and explains everything. Vincent then informs NASA Director Teddy Sanders. At first, Teddy tries to brush it off, suggesting it might be due to the storm. But Vincent points out that the solar panels have also been cleaned. That's when Teddy finally accepts the truth. Mark Watney is alive. This revelation puts them in a difficult position. The entire world already believes Mark is dead, and his funeral has been conducted. Now the question is, how will NASA face the media and admit that Mark Watney is actually still alive? In the end, they decide to reveal the truth to the media. But back on the Hermes, the crew heading back to Earth is not told about this. The decision is made to keep it from them so they don't feel devastated, or carry the guilt of leaving Mark behind to die on Mars. Meanwhile, it's been 70 days since Mark got stranded on Mars. By now, he's managed to secure food and water. But his next challenge is far bigger: figuring out a way to escape the planet. Mark knows one crucial thing. NASA's next mission, Ares 4, is scheduled to land on Mars at the Schiaparelli crater in exactly 4 years. The problem? That landing site is nearly 3,200 kilometers away from his current location. This becomes his only chance of survival. If he wants to make it off Mars alive, he has to somehow reach that spot in 4 years. After running the numbers, Mark calculates it'll take him about 50 days to get there. Without wasting any time, he starts preparing. He has a rover, but it's not fully functional. So, using his scientific skills, he salvages critical parts from a broken rover and installs them into the working one. After these modifications, his rover is finally capable of making the long journey. But a new problem arises. Mars nights are brutally cold, cold enough to freeze blood. To survive that, Mark digs up the nuclear battery his team had buried when they first arrived. It was hidden underground for safety, because if it ever got damaged, the radiation could instantly kill anyone exposed to it. Still, Mark takes the risk. Carefully handling it, he mounts the battery inside his rover, using the heat it generates to keep himself warm through the freezing nights. Back on Earth, NASA begins working on a rescue plan. They assign the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, the division responsible for building probes and spacecraft, the nearly impossible task of creating a supply probe in just 3 months. Normally, something like this would take at least 6 months, so the pressure on Director Bruce and his entire team is intense. NASA's master plan is simple but risky. Send a probe loaded with enough food and survival supplies to keep Mark alive for the next 4 years. Then, when the Ares 4 crew lands on Mars, they'll rescue him and bring him back to Earth. The JPL team works around the clock to make this mission happen. At the same time, NASA Administrator Teddy Sanders assigns a major responsibility to communications engineer Mindy. She's given full satellite access to track Mark's every move and monitor his condition in real time. And finally, Mark's hard work pays off. The potatoes he planted are now fully grown. Seeing the thriving crop puts a smile on his face, because the yield is far better than he ever expected. Mark managed to grow nearly 400 healthy potatoes. Using his ingenuity, he set aside the larger potatoes for food, while replanting the smaller ones back into the soil to grow more. Thanks to this smart planning, Mark secured a permanent food supply on a barren planet like Mars. Now, he no longer feared starving to death. But Mark knew very well that until he found a way to directly communicate with NASA, all his efforts could still go to waste. On a desolate planet like Mars, that was incredibly difficult. But he refused to give up. Eventually, he came up with a solution. Without wasting any time, Mark got into his rover and set off on an unknown journey. Back on Earth, Mindy and Vincent, who were monitoring his every move via satellite, were completely confused. They couldn't understand why Mark had left the safety of his base or where he was heading. For the past 13 days, Mark had been traveling in a single, unknown direction, leaving the NASA team totally puzzled. No one could figure out what his plan was, until suddenly, Vincent had a breakthrough. When he tracked Mark's route on the map, everything clicked. Mark was heading toward the Pathfinder lander, which NASA had sent to Mars's Ares Vallis back in 1986. Its mission was to collect data about Martian soil, magnetic properties, and the atmosphere, and send it back to NASA. However, in 1997, its battery died completely, and all communication was lost forever. Since then, it has remained buried somewhere beneath the Martian dust, until now, when Mark saw it as his last hope. Vincent's guess turned out to be absolutely right. Mark found the buried Pathfinder and brought it back to his habitat. But re-establishing contact would only be possible if NASA still had the same model on Earth. Realizing this, Vincent rushed to JPL in California, where another Pathfinder unit was preserved. He also called in the retired scientists who had worked on the mission back in 1997. Now, efforts began on both sides to bring the old system back to life. Meanwhile, Mark removed the old battery from Pathfinder and connected it to his habitat's power supply. Luckily, it powered on. As soon as Mark pointed its antenna toward Earth, the model at JPL received the signal. After years of silence, the old lander was finally responding again. Seeing this, Kapoor was overjoyed. However, the actual control of Pathfinder was in the hands of JPL technician Tim. He immediately sent commands to activate the camera, triggering the camera on Mars as well. When Mark saw the camera move, he realized his plan had worked. Someone, somewhere, was finally trying to communicate with him. Mark didn't waste a second. He quickly wrote a question on a board and held it up in front of the camera. "Is anyone receiving my signal?" He set up a simple system, yes on one side and no on the other. As soon as Vincent's team saw the question, they immediately turned the camera toward yes. The moment Mark saw the camera on Mars shift to yes, he was overwhelmed with joy. At that point, he knew for sure he was no longer alone. But communicating with Vincent still wasn't easy. Because of the massive distance between Earth and Mars, it took nearly an hour for a single question to reach Vincent, and another hour for the camera to turn and respond. On top of that, only Mark could ask questions, and only in yes or no. Vincent had no direct way to speak back, so Mark put his scientific mind to work. He knew that the Pathfinder camera could rotate 360 degrees in a full circle. That gave him an idea. He decided to use the hexadecimal number system. By converting hexadecimal numbers into ASCII code, he could form words. On the other side, Vincent's team set up hexadecimal markers around the Pathfinder, allowing them to slowly start communicating with Mark. But this method was painfully slow. So NASA scientists sent Mark a set of codes. Using those, Mark managed to connect his rover to the Pathfinder, allowing him to communicate through text messages using the rover. NASA then sent him a message. They had officially begun a rescue mission and would first send him the supplies he needed to survive. Reading this, Mark was filled with hope. He could finally see a chance of making it out alive. Mark then asked NASA if his crew knew he was still alive. NASA replied no. That answer made Mark furious. But now that communication had been established, NASA decided to inform the crew. When the team heard the news, they were stunned. They were relieved that Mark was alive, but at the same time, they were overwhelmed with guilt for leaving him behind. Meanwhile, Mark kept sending regular updates to NASA about his condition and the status of his habitat. Everything seemed to be going well. His potato crops were growing successfully. But one night, a terrifying accident changed everything. Due to repeated use, the airlock could no longer handle the pressure, and it suddenly exploded. The blast threw Mark across the area and punctured his helmet. Acting fast, he sealed the hole with tape. However, when he got back inside the habitat, the deadly cold of Mars had already done irreversible damage. His entire crop and the essential bacteria in the soil had been completely destroyed. At that point, growing food again became impossible. Because of this, Mark becomes deeply depressed. The food he has left is only enough to last about 100 days. Back on Earth, NASA prepares a supply mission to save Mark. But due to the rushed construction, the rocket explodes just moments after launch. Mark's last hope is shattered. He sends a final message to Commander Melissa Lewis, asking that if he dies, she should tell his parents that their son died for a greater and noble cause. Still, Mark hasn't given up. Instead, he prepares himself for every possible situation. Meanwhile, on Earth, the chief scientist and deputy chief scientist of the China National Space Administration watch the news of the failed rescue mission. Out of humanity, China decides to help and offers NASA a ready-to-use booster rocket. Now, NASA has one more chance. Then comes Rich Purnell, a genius but slightly eccentric astrodynamicist at NASA. He comes up with a crazy yet brilliant plan known as the Rich Purnell Maneuver. The idea is not to land the Hermes spacecraft on Earth, but instead use Earth's gravity like a slingshot to send it back toward Mars. It's an extremely risky plan, and the NASA director rejects it. But mission director Mitch Henderson secretly sends the plan to the Hermes crew. Now the decision is theirs: return home safely, or risk their lives on another 500-plus day journey to save their friend. Without a moment's hesitation, the entire team chooses to go back for Mark. Now it's Mark's turn to do his part. He must travel for 50 long days to reach the MAV that was pre-positioned for the Ares 4 mission. It's a lonely and dangerous journey, where he survives by eating raw potatoes and jokingly calls himself a space pirate as he heads toward the MAV on his own terms. Wherever Mark goes on Mars, He becomes the first human to ever step there. That spirit keeps his morale from breaking. Finally, Mark reaches the MAV. But to make it light enough to reach orbit, NASA instructs him to remove everything unnecessary: windows, control panels, and even the nose cone. Basically, Mark has to fly in an open-top, convertible rocket, covered only with a tarp. Meanwhile, the Hermes reaches Mars orbit. Mark launches the MAV, but during liftoff, the speed becomes so intense that the tarp rips apart, and Mark loses consciousness. Even though Mark had separated from the MAV rocket and was now orbiting Mars, things still weren't in his favor. He was about 68 kilometers away from the Hermes, making it impossible for Commander Lewis to bring him on board. At that point, Lewis ordered Martinez to fire up the Hermes engines, and using the thrusters, they pushed the ship as close to the MAV as possible. But meanwhile, Mark was still unconscious inside the MAV. When he finally regained consciousness, hearing his voice filled Lewis and the entire crew with relief. However, there was still a major problem. The rotational speed difference between the MAV and Hermes was about 42 meters per second. Because of that, it was still impossible to safely bring Mark aboard. The only way to rescue him was to slow down Hermes' rotation and match it with the MAV. But they couldn't restart the engines again, because they didn't have enough fuel left to make it back to Earth. So Commander Lewis came up with another crazy plan. She decided to detonate a small explosive inside the spaceship's airlock to adjust its speed. Even after that, there was still some distance left between them. That's when Mark made his final move. He punctured a small hole in his spacesuit glove and used the escaping air pressure to propel himself forward, basically flying like Iron Man toward the Hermes. Commander Lewis moved forward, secured by a tether, trying to catch him. For a moment, it looked like she might miss, but then Mark grabbed the rope. Finally, they pulled him safely inside the spacecraft. As soon as the news broke, NASA and the entire world erupted in celebration. After being stranded alone on Mars for months, Mark Watney had finally made it back to his crew, back home. His first day on Earth marked the beginning of a new life. Now he trains astronauts at NASA, inspiring them with stories of his survival and resilience. And with that, the story comes to an end. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like and comment. See you in the next one.